They didn't scream when they hurt you. They didn't raise their hands or throw stones where the world could see. Instead, they used silence as a weapon. Subtle actions, quiet betrayals, and invisible wounds that no one else could name. They smiled in public while slowly dismantling your spirit behind closed doors. What they did wasn't always loud, but it was intentional, and the weight of that quiet cruelty was heavier than any shouted insult. You tried to explain it once, how it wasn't just what they did, but what they refused to say, what they allowed behind your back while pretending loyalty to your face. But no one listened. Because their hands looked clean, because the damage left no visible bruises, because emotional wounds rarely bleed in ways others can see. So you carried it alone. You smiled through the cracks. You walked into rooms where your name had already been shredded like paper and pretended you didn't smell the betrayal. You watched those you trusted turn into strangers wearing masks, and still you kept silent. Not because you didn't feel, but because you refused to let their darkness turn you cold. You stayed kind. You stayed present. You stayed real. And yet, in the back of your mind, there was always the lingering question, why doesn't God stop this? Why does He allow people to do harm in secret and walk away untouched? Why does it feel like silence protects the wrong people? But what you didn't know was this. While they were planting lies in secret, you were burying prayers in faith. And faith, unlike deception, doesn't rot in the dark. It grows, it strengthens, it multiplies. You may not have seen the fruit right away, but heaven saw the soil. God was never absent. He was watching when no one else did, and He wasn't just watching to comfort you. He was watching to build something. You see, when people hurt you in silence, they convince themselves they'll never be exposed. They believe their mask will last. They think that if judgment hasn't come yet, it never will. But God is not passive. He is patient, and that patience is not for their benefit. It's for His plan. God doesn't always expose people in the same place they broke you. Sometimes He waits until they are standing in a position where the truth cannot be escaped, rewritten, or denied. When God exposes, He makes sure there is no doubt left. He doesn't need help to do it. He doesn't need your anger, your defense, or your revenge. All He needs is your trust. And if you gave Him that, if you walked away instead of lashing out, if you chose silence instead of retaliation, then you already won. Because what's coming next is not a battle, it's a revelation. They hurt you in silence, but God is preparing their lesson in public, not out of cruelty, but out of divine justice. The very people who built their version of the truth in private are about to be confronted by the reality of what they've done in front of the world. The same lips that whispered against you will tremble when the truth stands taller than their lies. And when it does, you won't need to say anything. You won't need to show up to defend your name. The truth will do what you couldn't. It will stand, it will speak, and it will be seen. God is not mocked. What they sowed, they will reap, and the tears they ignored, the peace they disrupted, the damage they denied, it is all returning, not as punishment, but as instruction. Heaven is still a school, and for those who thought they could harm others quietly and never be held accountable, there is a lesson coming, a lesson that will be written on their own actions, a lesson they will never forget. There's a strange illusion that forms when people do wrong and nothing seems to happen. They start to believe they're untouchable. They take your silence as weakness, your mercy as foolishness, and God's patience as indifference. But that's only because they confuse delay with escape. The truth is, when God doesn't move immediately, it's not because He didn't see. It's because he's letting the weight of their choices grow to the size of their consequences. Divine justice doesn't arrive in haste. It arrives in fullness, and by the time it shows up, it's not subtle, it's unmistakable. You see, when someone hurts you and walks away without accountability, they start to build a cycle, a routine, a habit, and the more they repeat it, the more comfortable they become in their own deception. It no longer feels wrong to them. It becomes normal. And that's when God begins to set the stage, not with lightning, not with sudden destruction, but with silence so deep it lets them think they're safe. That's the strategy of heaven. Because sometimes, in order to expose darkness, God allows it to grow confident. So its fall is not only seen, but undeniable. And while they continue their behavior unchecked, something sacred is happening in your life. The silence that wounded you is becoming your strength. The tears you cried in private are being woven into the very fabric of your future peace. Your isolation wasn't punishment, it was preparation. Because when God reveals the truth, He doesn't just do it to correct others, He does it to elevate you. What you endured in secret, He will honor in public. The pain they thought was hidden is the very soil He is using to birth your next season. Do not think for a moment that God's delay is a denial. Do not let the quiet fool you. The silence you endured is not the same silence that surrounds them now. Yours was filled with pain. Theirs is filled with the ticking of consequence. Because every action, every betrayal, every manipulation carries within it the seed of return. They thought they walked away clean, but no one walks away from truth. It follows. It waits. It reappears when the mask can no longer be held in place. And when that happens, when the curtain finally falls, there will be no confusion. God will make sure of it. He doesn't just reveal what was done, He reveals why it was done. He brings motives to the surface. He uncovers intentions. He shows the difference between who you were and who they pretended to be. And when that day comes, those who once doubted your version of the story will be silent, not because you convinced them, but because truth finally did what it always does. It stood tall. You won't have to seek revenge. You won't need to vindicate yourself. That's not your burden to carry. Your only job is to stay aligned with who you are. Stay soft in heart. Stay anchored in your values. Stay quiet, not out of fear, but out of strength. Because when God is preparing a public lesson, the last thing He needs is your interference. He just needs your faith, and the lesson will be clear. It will be felt. It will be personal. Those who built their comfort on your pain will watch that comfort vanish, not because you wished it, but because what we send into the world always finds its way back. That's not karma. That's design. God designed the universe to echo, to reflect, to multiply what we give. And when He says, "Vengeance is mine," He means it, not just in wrath, but in justice. So breathe, rest, heal. The silence that once broke you is now your weapon, because it's in the silence that God moves unseen, arranges the pieces, and prepares the moment when truth no longer needs to be defended. It simply arrives. There is a sacred kind of justice that doesn't require your voice to be raised. It doesn't need you to chase the people who harmed you. It doesn't ask you to explain your pain to those who never intended to understand it. This justice moves in the unseen places, in the quiet chambers of divine timing. It works while you sleep, while you recover, while you try to piece together your heart. And when it arrives, it doesn't ask for an audience, it draws one, because God doesn't just heal, He reveals. And when He reveals, it's never partial, it's never vague, it's undeniable. You were never meant to fight every battle. You were never called to expose every lie, respond to every whisper, or carry the weight of making people see what they chose to ignore. That's why your silence was powerful. Not because you had no words, but because you had wisdom. You understood, even through your tears, that your dignity was worth more than your defense. You chose peace over pettiness. You chose grace over gossip. And in doing so, you invited heaven to fight on your behalf. What most people don't understand is that the process of exposure is rarely loud at first. It starts with small cracks, opportunities slipping through their hands, relationships breaking in ways they can't explain, peace fleeing without warning. Slowly, the life they built on falsehood begins to collapse. And it doesn't collapse because you wished for it. It collapses because it was never built on truth to begin with. God simply removes the illusion they tried so hard to maintain. And as that collapse begins, something beautiful rises in you. A quiet strength, refined through suffering, begins to take shape. The tears that once blurred your vision are wiped away, and you start to see the bigger picture. You begin to understand that God wasn't ignoring your pain. He was storing it. He was gathering every cry, every prayer, every sigh too deep for words, and shaping them into the foundation of your next chapter, one where you are no longer a victim of what was done in the dark, but a witness to what is being brought into the light. And that light isn't just for them, it's for you. It's the light that reminds you that your pain had purpose, that your silence had strength, that your faith had weight. And while they were busy building narratives, God was building you, preparing you, strengthening your core so that when your moment came, not just for justice, but for elevation, you would stand not with bitterness, but with peace. Because that's the most powerful part of divine justice. It restores you, not only in reputation, but in spirit. It doesn't just prove others wrong, it makes you whole again. And in that wholeness, you'll realize something profound. The people who hurt you were never truly free. They were bound by their own need to control, to deceive, to diminish others to feel powerful. And now, the weight of their choices has come home to them. They are face to face with the silence they once used as a weapon. But this time, it speaks louder than anything they can say. And you? You're not the same. You've grown. You've learned. You've endured. You've risen. Not in spite of the silence, but because of it. What they tried to break became what God used to build. What they tried to bury became what God used to plant. And now the harvest is coming, not just for you, but to reveal to the world the truth when covered by God cannot be hidden forever. There's something deeply humbling about the way God writes justice into our lives. It doesn't always come in a moment of triumph. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in new opportunities, unexpected peace, or a deep clarity that suddenly makes all the pain make sense. And when you look back, you begin to see how every season of betrayal, every silent hurt, every moment where you questioned your worth, was actually leading you somewhere higher, not just in status or success, but in soul. You didn't just survive what they did to you, you became someone stronger because of it. That's why you don't need to run after those who hurt you. You don't need to chase apologies or explanations. God knows who you are, and more importantly, He knows who they are. And while they were focused on appearances, on controlling how others see them, you were growing roots, quietly, patiently, faithfully. You were becoming immovable in your integrity. And that's why, when God begins to lift you, it will not just be a moment of blessing, it will be a message that your silence was not weakness, it was worship, it was trust, it was a declaration that you believed in a higher justice than what the world could offer. What they did behind your back is already confronting them, maybe not yet in front of people, but inside, in their sleep, in their relationships, in the peace that continues to slip through their hands. You cannot escape what you create, and they created pain with no repentance. That kind of pattern always returns, not because God is cruel, but because God is just. He teaches in echoes, He reveals through mirrors, and sooner or later they will face a version of themselves they don't recognize, crafted by the very choices they made when they thought no one would notice. And in that moment, when their lesson finally arrives, you will not have to speak a word. You won't need to say, "I told you so." You won't have to relive the pain to prove your side. Because God doesn't just reveal the truth, He reveals the reason. He brings understanding so deep, even their denial begins to crack. And when it does, you'll be standing in a different place. Not a place of revenge, but of redemption. Not because they finally got what they deserved, but because you finally became who you were always meant to be. You see, the most dangerous thing your enemies underestimated wasn't your silence. It was your resilience. They thought hurting you would end you, that their betrayal would silence your voice, but it didn't. It refined your voice. It gave you depth. It gave you substance. And that's something they can never duplicate. They tried to discredit you, but in doing so they revealed their own character. They tried to bury you quietly, but in doing so they awakened something in you that no amount of manipulation could destroy. And as God continues to move in your life, don't be surprised when He places you in rooms they thought you'd never reach. Don't be shocked when your name is honored in places where they once tried to erase it, because elevation is not a reward, it's a result. It's what happens when you stay faithful in the quiet places, when you hold your peace even when it hurts, when you trust God even when it feels like nothing is changing. He was never blind. He was never silent. He was just writing a longer story, one with more power, more grace, and more meaning than anything they ever imagined. There will always be people who mistake your kindness for weakness, people who take advantage of your soft heart, who believe that because you didn't respond with rage, you must have nothing within you but silence. But what they never realized is that your silence wasn't emptiness. It was a shield. It was the space where God was doing His deepest work. While they saw quiet submission, heaven saw sacred preparation. While they whispered behind your back, God was whispering into your future. Those who caused harm in secret often do so with a false sense of security. They assume their mask will never slip. They believe the version of themselves they present to the world is strong enough to cover the damage they've done. But the truth has a way of aging well, and over time it grows stronger, while lies begin to fade. Eventually their charm no longer blinds people. Their manipulation begins to lose power, and everything they built to protect their image begins to unravel, not because you exposed them, but because truth doesn't need help to breathe. It just needs time. And when that truth begins to rise, it doesn't need your voice. It carries its own authority. The very people who once questioned you will begin to question them. The ones who believed the rumors will remember the consistency of your character. They'll see that you didn't fight back with bitterness, and that will say more than any defense ever could. Because time doesn't just reveal people, It reveals pattern, and God uses those patterns to show the difference between someone who endures in integrity and someone who performs with deception. You may not realize it now, but God has been building something sacred in your restraint. Every time you chose not to retaliate, heaven built another layer of strength in you. Every moment you cried in silence, rather than lash out in public, He poured more favor into your story. And now that story is about to shift, not just in your healing, but in your rising. Not just in your peace, but in your position. Because when God decides it's time for truth to speak, it doesn't whisper, it roars. And when it roars, it doesn't just correct the record, it realigns the future. It places you in front of people who never knew what you went through, but can see the light that came out of your pain. It opens doors that no apology could ever unlock. It brings blessings that were delayed, not denied, because God was waiting until the moment they would be most undeniable. You won't need to celebrate anyone's downfall. That's not your nature. That was never your desire. All you ever wanted was peace. And peace is exactly what God is preparing to pour into your life. Not just a temporary escape from pain, but a permanent shift into something higher, something sacred, something that can no longer be touched by those who once hurt you. And that's the beautiful irony of it all. The very people who tried to break you in silence are about to watch your restoration in public. They'll see you walk with a peace they never gave you. They'll watch you stand in strength they never imagined you'd find. And they'll realize that the silence they thought made them powerful was the very space God used to build your comeback. Because that's who God is. He doesn't just restore, He reveals. He doesn't just heal, He elevates. And when He does, no whisper, no rumor, no betrayal can hold back what He's releasing over your life. There is something unshakable about a person who has walked through fire and didn't lose their faith. You became that person, not because you never doubted, not because you never cried, but because you didn't let the darkness consume you. You stayed close to God even when you couldn't feel Him. You held on when it felt like everything around you was slipping. And now, what you thought was going to destroy you is becoming the very reason you rise with more wisdom, more clarity, and more purpose than ever before. What they did in silence was never missed by God. He didn't overlook the manipulation, the betrayal, or the subtle ways they tried to discredit your worth. He saw the smiles they wore in public, while their hearts brewed judgment behind your back. He saw the fake concern, the rehearsed innocence, the effort they put into appearing good while treating you like you didn't matter. And He said nothing at the time, not because He approved, but because He was preparing their moment of reckoning, preparing your moment of peace, and preparing the world to see a divine reversal that cannot be explained by logic, only by grace. You see, divine justice doesn't just expose sin. It brings balance to the spiritual order. It makes sure that the pain of the innocent does not go unanswered. It ensures that those who have sown harm do not reap peace, and it gently but firmly shows the world what integrity looks like when tested. You were the test, and you passed it. Not by being perfect, but by staying true to who you are, even when it would have been easier to harden your heart. And now that you've endured the silence, now that you've survived the private storms, they're going to see what it means for God to restore what was stolen. They'll see you walk in blessings they thought you'd never receive. They'll hear your name spoken in places where they tried to erase it. They'll watch you thrive in a life they assumed they had the power to interrupt, but they never had that power, not truly, because what God ordains cannot be stopped by human betrayal, and what God protects cannot be destroyed by secret plans. And it won't be about revenge. That was never your spirit. This will be about renewal. You'll begin to feel joy again, not the surface kind that comes and goes, but the steady kind that lives in your bones. You'll begin to trust again. Not because people have changed, but because you've learned to walk with wisdom. You'll no longer chase validation. You'll no longer need to explain your side. The peace you carry will say everything, and that peace will be loud. Louder than their lies, louder than their gossip, louder than the silence they tried to use as their weapon. What they didn't understand is that silence is holy ground. God speaks to the soul in silence. He strengthens character, deepens faith, and trains endurance in that stillness. And while they used silence to hurt you, you used silence to heal. They sat in darkness to plot. You sat in darkness to pray. That's why your reward will never look like theirs. Because you weren't the same, not in motive, not in method, and not in heart. The shift is coming, not just in how others see you, but in how you see yourself. You'll no longer feel the need to shrink to keep the peace. You'll stop walking into rooms wondering if you belong. You'll move with quiet confidence because you've earned it in a war no one else saw. God saw it, and that was enough. Now the silence is breaking, not with vengeance, but with clarity, not with chaos, but with peace. And in that peace there will be a stillness that speaks louder than every insult you endured, every moment you were excluded, and every time you were treated as if your heart didn't matter. You'll find yourself standing in the very place they thought you'd never reach. Not because you forced your way in, but because God opened a door that no man could shut. He didn't do it in a rush. He did it right. They will look at you and wonder how you healed so well. They'll look at your joy and not understand how you carried that much pain and still found light. But you'll know. You'll know the nights you cried until your body ached. You'll know the prayers you whispered through trembling lips. You'll remember the days you almost gave up, and the grace that held you together when everything else fell apart. And that knowing will become your quiet strength. You won't need to explain how you made it. You won't need to defend how you found peace, because the evidence of your healing will be undeniable. The purity in your presence will speak for itself. The peace in your voice, the light in your eyes, the calm in your spirit. And those who once wounded you in silence will sit with the weight of what they did, not because you pointed a finger, but because their own soul will start asking questions they can no longer avoid. That is the lesson God is preparing, not one written in punishment, but in divine precision. He's not just restoring your life, He's transforming your story into something holy. He's making sure that the people who stayed silent when they should have spoken, who betrayed when they should have protected, who judged when they should have understood, He's making sure they see the difference between who you were and who they chose to be. And you'll walk in freedom, the kind that doesn't need validation, the kind that isn't chained to bitterness, the kind that doesn't replay what happened anymore because you're too busy walking in what God is doing now. You'll walk in rooms knowing your presence has weight. You'll speak from a place of wisdom, not pain. You'll love again, not because it's safe, but because your heart is healed. Let them say what they want. Let them believe what they need to believe. Let them rewrite the past if it helps them sleep. You don't need to fix the narrative. God already wrote the ending, and it ends with you whole. It ends with you elevated. It ends with you at peace. Because they hurt you in silence, But God never stayed silent, and now it's his voice that will echo the loudest.